That was footage from inside a restaurant on the Corniche Al Masra in Lebanon's capital, Beirut, on Wednesday, as ordinary people going about their business suddenly found themselves in a man-made apocalypse. And it took just 10 minutes for Israel to carry out the biggest atrocity that Lebanon has seen in almost 40 years. In just a little over 600 seconds, Israel struck more than 100 sites across Lebanon on Wednesday, raining 1,000-pound bombs down on a densely populated residential area in Beirut in southern Lebanon. The result was carnage, with over 300 people killed, and wounding well over 1,000 people. Residents as well as Lebanese officials have said that the majority of those killed and injured were civilians, including children and the elderly. The country's Prime Minister, Nawaf Salam, posted this: "While we welcomed the agreement between Iran and the United States of America and intensified our efforts to reach an agreement for the ceasefire in Lebanon, Israel continues to expand its aggressions that have targeted densely populated residential neighborhoods, claiming the lives of unarmed civilians in various parts of Lebanon, particularly in the capital Beirut, heedless of all regional and international efforts to stop the war, not to mention its utter disregard for the principles of international law and international humanitarian law, which is never respected in the first place. And all friends of Lebanon are called upon to help us stop these aggressions by all available means." Sky News' Alex Crawford spoke to first responders on the scene in Beirut on Thursday.
What did you notice as soon as you arrived here?
It was a devil. It was a devil. People is burning as grilled.
What you saw as you arrived, which sounded like a scene no one would want to see.
Yes, I was realizing I arrived to Gaza or to Beirut. In the same point. It was the same as Gaza disaster.
As you put a piece of burger on a grill, people was grilled. Really, as I tell you, it's not like you see. People was grilled. The one who I pick him up, I take him bones.
All around here. All around here are large residential blocks. How would you describe this area? Because you're hearing the Israeli military are saying they were specifically targeting Hezbollah infrastructure, command and control centers.
I want to tell all people, all world. This world will tell us that there is Hezbollah here and Hezbollah here. In Beirut, there is no Hezbollah. As we are a child of Beirut, we are not Hezbollah. And we're not including for Hezbollah. And we're not with Hezbollah.
Well, there clearly are
And
some Hezbollah elements in the capital city.
If now they tell me that there's a Jewish people here and he needs our help, we will help him. Our message is peace.
And humanity.
But what happened here yesterday, this area, it's food and beverage containers. And as we know, as we see, it's for a closed container. There's no military here. Beirut, it's under community, under government
authority.
Yeah. But don't take this big forward that Hezbollah and Beirut. No, Hezbollah is not in Beirut.
Israel's narrative of targeting Hezbollah in Beirut came under further pressure on Newsnight. Nada Makaran Atala is a correspondent based in Beirut for the UAE paper The National, and she began by telling Newsnight the impact of the brutal Israeli assault.
What it means concretely on the ground, it means that until now, you still have people looking for their loved ones. It means that, people were just frantically calling their families, because these strikes, they happen in like residential buildings, they happen in densely populated area, and they came with no warning. They did not happen in Hezbollah affiliated areas. They did not happen in areas, in neighborhoods where the group is influential. It happens in the central, in the center of Beirut, in areas where you have lots of shops, you have lots of families. I visited myself 3 of those strikes, and they were all residential buildings that were almost completely collapsed, and they all had many victims, and rescuers still looking for survivors or just human remains.
Now, Israel claims that it was targeting more than 100 Hezbollah command centers, and that most of it was inside civilian areas as a part of Hezbollah's strategy of using human shields. So this all sounds pretty familiar, as do the kinds of sites Israel struck yesterday, including such deadly military centers such as a funeral, a mosque, a traditional bakery, and even a car wash. Israel also said it did everything it could do to mitigate harm to civilians. Atala was asked if she'd seen any evidence of that at all.
And they're not providing us with any evidence, so they can say whatever they want. What I see on the ground, I see families terrorized. I've seen videos of family jumping out of balconies because they were so scared. I've seen videos, pictures of children injured by shrapnels, a young girl trapped under the rubble. And this is also my city. I live here. I've walked on the streets countless times. I had friends who lived in the very same building, one of the very same buildings that was targeted. They should be providing evidence. And as the fact that the strikes came without warning and also during rush hours, so it means that the streets were packed. It has really increased the number of casualties, and especially also the fact that all the strikes came at the same time.
Dalia, when it comes to these strikes, of course, Israel have said, as we mentioned before, that they were specifically targeting Hezbollah military command centers, etc., etc. Now, for people who don't know at home, there's a thing called the Dahia Doctrine, which is Israel's military strategy of deliberately targeting civilian structures to try and lower the morale of the people they're attacking so low that it forces them into capitulation, essentially. What do you think is more likely, the former or the latter?
I mean, that's exactly what I was going to talk about. The Dahia Doctrine, it is the core principle of Israeli military strategy that obviously we saw unfold in Gaza, but it actually originated in 2006 in Beirut. There's an area of Beirut called Dahia, and this is when we first saw the indications of this as a new military strategy by the Israeli state, which is, as you mentioned, Helene, traditionally in warfare, in modern warfare, there is a sense of, you have civilian infrastructure, you have hospitals, you have universities, you have residential areas, and you have military infrastructure. And in a war, military infrastructure is vulnerable and is up for being targeted, and civilian infrastructure and civilians is supposed to be sacrosanct. Now, the Dahia Doctrine represents a complete inversion of that, where in fact you hammer the civilian infrastructure more, in fact, than you hammer the military infrastructure in order to, as you say there, Helena, destroy civilian morale, to force, there's some kind of bizarre idea that if you cripple a population, then they will be more likely to overthrow their government. Well, obviously, if people are sort of rebuilding their lives from the ashes of nothing, I don't think that, forming some kind of organized political force to take over from an organization that has been in power since like the 80s is really going to be what they have capacity for. But I also think part of it is a sense of trying to, because one of the issues that Israel had in Gaza is that no matter how many times they killed Hamas operatives, Hamas was just able to replenish itself several times over. The ranks of Hamas were never actually weakened numerically. And so I believe Israel makes this calculation where they say, well, look, where is Hamas, where is Hezbollah able to draw their personnel from? It's from the society, it's from the community. And so what we'll do is we will just destroy that society, destroy that community so that there is no one to draw from. Now, obviously, that is tantamount to genocide. And that is what the Dahia Doctrine is. So what we have is an incredibly powerful military that has as its named military strategy a genocidal one that is specifically targeting the breaking down of a civil society. And we're not just seeing it in Lebanon. Obviously, we saw it in Gaza. We're also seeing it to an extent in Iran. Before the ceasefire, we saw the attacking of the bombing of pharmaceutical factories, places that were producing medicines for cancer patients. We saw the bombing of Sharif University, which was widely considered to be the MIT of the Middle East. We're seeing it in the killing of journalists. And so we actually, this is a strategy that has come to a lot of our foreminds in the past, sort of since 2023, because we've seen it so visibly in Gaza. But it's actually a doctrine that was invented in Lebanon in 2006, many years ago. And Israel has been getting away with it for that long. So why would it not assume that it can't get away with it now?
I saw a really interesting clip They came across my feed on Twitter, I believe. And it was a spokesperson for the Israeli Foreign Office, filming one of those kind of like social media videos as politicians tend to do nowadays, in the city of Arad, which is in the Negev desert, pointing at a kind of a residential flat that had been hit by an Iranian rocket or Iranian ballistic missile, and said, look at this. This could be London or Rome tomorrow, because Iran has the potential to target European cities now. And I thought the absolute temerity, the barefaced cheek of Israel to complain about attacks on civilian infrastructure, and indeed to imply that this is something that is imminently going to happen to Western countries, especially those in Europe, when this is the number one culprit of attacks on civilian infrastructure, not only like in that particular area of the world, but you know, like outside of maybe Ukraine is another place we've seen recently that's seen such heavy devastation on civilian areas. If you compare the pictures you're getting out of Beirut with those from Mariupol, for example. And Israel are out there trying to think that Iran is somehow the threat here, when Iran has done significantly less attacks on civilians, significantly fewer attacks on civilians than Israel has. And also, Western media, Western politicians, perfectly happy to call out Russian attacks, as we saw in Mariupol and places like that, or Kramatorsk or Bucha. And yet, significantly worse and more devastating attacks with a deliberate intention of demoralizing a civilian population to try and break apart civil society, as you say, from Israel. And we get mute condemnation. I mean, we've got radio silence for much of the start of the Gaza genocide, but now the Western populations have turned against Israel, you get very kind of
tokenistic.
Tokenistic call-outs here of what Lebanon is doing, or what is being done to Lebanon by Israel. And again, the comparison here is so stark. And again, they're allowed to get away with it because they're a Western proxy in the region.
But Israeli civilians, Italian civilians, you know, when he says, you know, this could be London, this could be Rome, the civilians that live in those cities, the white ones at least, are humans. And the civilians that live in Lebanon and in Gaza are not humans. They're future terrorists. I'll never forget, I believe I was reading an Amnesty report about human rights abuses at checkpoints, at Israeli checkpoints in Palestine. And they were interviewing Israeli military personnel. And one of them talks about shooting a pregnant woman in the stomach. And he says, you know, that baby was going to grow up to be a terrorist anyway. So it's like that when he's saying, look at this could be London, this could be Rome tomorrow, what he's saying is that we, humans, people, civilians, subjects with rights, are under threat. And our violence and death upon us is meaningful and grievable. But violence and death being borne by the people of southern Beirut, by people of Gaza, is securitizing the region. It's killing people who are only going to become terrorists. And this is where that, unfortunately, sometimes sounds kind of rather reductive, but is the only place where you end up, which is white supremacy, racism.
100%. I mean, literally, like, there's internal documentation, internal like Hasbara strategy coming out of Israel, essentially saying, well, our standing in Western Europe and in the United States more broadly is massively on the way down. Our strategy for survival to be able to make sure we are seen to be like totally inseparable, or to be totally, you know, beholden, or those countries be beholden on us, is to ramp up Islamophobia, specifically targeting, ramping up Islamophobia in Western Europe, essentially strategizing, you know, civil unrest in countries in Western Europe by peddling conspiracy and peddling racism to try and make sure that Western countries perceive Israel as the bulwark against a perceived threat from Muslims overseas. Like, that was their explicit strategy. So it's perfectly reasonable that they can also use that same strategy to dehumanize the Arabs that surround them, to make, as you say, make them seem less than human, that their lives are potentially worthless. And worth pointing out for viewers at home as well, you know, talk about military infrastructure in civilian areas. The headquarters of the IDF, literally in the center of Tel Aviv. And if it got struck tomorrow by Iran as a legitimate military target, that it would be, there'd be instant, widespread condemnation of everybody. But those same thing happens to any other military installation of any other country surrounding Israel. When they attack it, suddenly it's justified action and it's human shields.